Under the heavy, oppressive sky of a starless night, in a small forgotten town in Alabama, the inhabitants were cradled by a legend that never faded. Every winter, stories echoed through the walls of homes, whispered between families who locked their doors at night, fearing a forbidden name. They called the creature the Hanged Man. I, Morticia, have been there on many of those nights. I walked through the forgotten alleys where the past still weighed heavily, and whispers gathered like dust, forming a legend that waited for its moment to be reborn. To them, the Hanged Man was just a frightening tale, but I knew him well, and I understood that every story is born from a dark truth. A long time ago, before cars and streetlights, Nathaniel Rourke was the judge of the town, famous for his severe temper and incorruptible morals. Tall, with deep eyes, Nathaniel wore a rope around his neck to judge criminals and those he deemed impure. But the justice he preached was cruel and arbitrary. His victims always ended up hanging from a centuries-old tree at the edge of town, where their bodies swayed in the wind like grim warnings. Nathaniel, however, would not escape his own justice. One day, an angry mob took the square. They hanged him from the same tree where he had taken so many lives. The town wanted to forget, but vengeful souls never rest in peace, and thus the legend of the Hanged Man was born. Now, the inhabitants of Cullman avoided speaking of him. But that winter was far from calm. For the young souls seeking danger and excitement, the legend of the Hanged Man seemed like a tempting challenge. And on that cold December night, 4 teenagers decided to test their courage. Dylan, a restless and ambitious boy, considered himself above superstitions. At 18, he believed only in what he could see, and his sharp, ironic eyes seemed to mock even the most serious things. His friends, however, were more cautious. Mason, his best friend, was Dylan's opposite, introverted and observant, silently respecting the unknown. At 17, he preferred not to take risks, but the fear of losing Dylan's friendship dragged him into adventures that always ended in chaos. Amélie, a young French girl who had recently moved to town, was drawn to the dark. Her dark eyes, hidden beneath rebellious strands of hair, held secrets she never shared. She seemed to enjoy danger, and didn't hide her fascination with local legends. And last, there was Gina, a determined and realistic girl, known for not letting herself be intimidated. With her firm voice and determined stance, Gina was the anchor of the group. Unlike Dylan, she was aware of the dangers, but she was also skeptical about the supernatural. That night, Dylan gathered his friends in a clearing where the hanging tree still stood, crooked and with thick branches, its roots sinking into the ground like claws refusing to release the dead. The moon was hidden by clouds, and the silence was so deep it seemed to swallow even the wind. "Let's get this over with," Gina said, crossing her arms as she gave Dylan a doubtful look. "It's just an old tree, nothing more." Amélie smiled, watching the tree with curiosity. "You Americans have a knack for creating legends," she murmured. "But who says legends don't come from something real?" Dylan shook his head and stepped closer to the tree, defiant. "I'll show you this is just a story for kids." He placed his hand on the tree trunk. Mason watched nervously, and Gina rolled her eyes, but Amélie seemed hypnotized. It was then that something happened. Dylan felt an intense cold take over his body. His hand went numb, as if the tree was absorbing his energy. He tried to pull away but couldn't. It was as though something invisible was holding him there, forcing him to look up. And then he saw it. Suspended between the branches was a shadow, like a slim and distorted figure, a face obscured by darkness, but with bright eyes that stared at him. Dylan heard a deep, cutting voice in his mind like sharp blades. "Asterisk, do you think you can escape judgment, boy?" Asterisk. He recoiled, gasping, as the figure disappeared. His friends looked at him, alarmed, but Dylan, pale and trembling, tried to hide it. "It was just the cold," he murmured, trying not to show the fear taking over his heart. But it wouldn't end there. Over the following weeks, Dylan began to change. He isolated himself more and more, haunted by terrible dreams where he saw himself hanged from the old tree. He woke up in the middle of the night, with sore hands, as if he had spent hours holding on to avoid falling. His friends noticed how pale and thin he was, but he refused any help. "Dylan, you're scaring me," Mason said one night, when he found him standing by the window, staring out with empty eyes. "You don't understand, Mason," Dylan replied, his voice low and dark. "The Hanged Man. He wants me to pay. He whispers to me. He says I'm just like him, that I must be judged." Mason felt a chill. He tried to convince Dylan to seek help, but his friend refused, claiming that no one could protect him. Gina and Amélie also noticed the change in him, and together they tried to convince him to leave the town, but Dylan was beyond their reach. Finally, on a stormy winter night, Mason, Gina, and Amelie decided to confront him. They went to his house, where they found the door ajar and the house in silence. They crossed the hallways until they reached Dylan's room, where they found him standing, staring at the mirror with an empty gaze. Upon seeing them, he let out a laugh that didn't sound like his own. "He wants me to go to the tree," he murmured as if in a trance. "He wants me to pay for my sins." Gina grabbed Dylan's arm tightly. "This is madness, Dylan. You haven't done anything wrong." But he just smiled, an empty, disturbing smile. "We all have sins, Gina. You, me, even you, Amelie." Amelie frowned but said nothing. She knew better than anyone that Dylan was right. That night, under a stormy sky, the friends tried to stop Dylan from going to the tree, but he seemed driven by some supernatural force. And I was there waiting, for I knew that in that moment, their fate was sealed. When they arrived at the clearing, Dylan walked up to the tree, and that's when they saw it. High in the branches, a dark figure watched them, with fiery eyes and a cruel expression. "Here ends your judgment, Nathaniel Rourke," whispered the creature, raising a hand like a judge. The branches moved like serpents, wrapping around Dylan, who began to choke, his feet rising off the ground while the others watched helpless. The hanged one's voice echoed like thunder, "All of you guilty. All of you, pay with your souls." And that night no one escaped. The tree devoured the souls of Dylan, Mason, Gina, and Amelie, and their screams echoed through the forest.